Okay, so I must say it was the generosity of this invitation, Carolina, to come and speak in her studio space that made me really come up with subject matter for today, because, you know, artists are always being asked to talk about their own work, and at a certain point, sort of think, well, let's expand that a bit, because it's not only working in the studio, it's working with artist colleagues and also the curators. So be prepared for a wee bit of art gossip, a wee bit of name dropping. So Carolina's a bridge for me to my past in Italy, but just a month or two ago I was talking with Tina Barton, who's the director at Adam Gallery at Victoria University in Wellington, and just chatting away about my life in the 60s here in Auckland. And she said, oh my goodness, you're a living bridge to an art history I can only read about. Well, that made me feel like a bit of a dinosaur. That's the truth. I was here as a young graphic design artist. Well, we called it commercial art in those days. I worked in advertising for the Auckland Star newspaper, long defunct. And while I was doing that, I started doing classes in painting, and I attended the Auckland Art Gallery. I started off with class in drawing, but I desperately wanted to learn painting. So I went to look for the teacher of painting, and who should it be? Yes, Colin McCann. In those days he was what was called keeper, and in order to enter his class, which was a Monday class held in the tower of the Auckland Art Gallery, I had to have an interview. And he wouldn't let me sit down, and I had to stand in front of him. He was sitting behind his desk. And he made me swear that I would treat the subject seriously for all my life. I didn't vow this. He wouldn't let me into the class. Well, I was very intimidated, but I wanted to be in the class. So he was there as a curator at the art gallery, having started off there as a cleaner and building his way up. Now that's how it was then. He couldn't make a living for years later, good 10 years after I met him, from his painting alone. That's not the case today. Curating is now really in New Zealand a profession of its own. And in a way, the roles are kind of reversing, where the curator is beginning to make the meaning of the work for the artist. It's a strange thing that's happening, and it's happening worldwide. I was perhaps lucky to live in a minor situation. I lived with my husband in the city of Trieste in Italy, which is a town about the size of Wellington. And both here and there, working with curator included having a studio visit and a critique of unfinished paintings. And then the curator would select which ones for a show, whether it was group or a solo show, organise a text, write it herself, or organise a critic to write it. And you'd work together on mounting the show, even in public galleries. This intimacy has largely vanished now, and the artists, from what I hear, are beginning to feel a bit like the tomato growers. That is, they lose control of their work the moment it leaves the studio. In Italy, the opening hours of the private dealer galleries are between 4 and 8 in the afternoon, or at least they were. I'm talking about 10 to 15 years ago. And the artists would gallery hop. And they did this because they knew that they'd bang into each other, and all sorts of discussions would start up in the private gallery space. And they'd become quite philosophical and often very heated, and you'd quite often move on to a trattoria afterwards to continue. It's very different here, I've always found. The private gallery space is a competitive space for artists. I think it's because there's much more collecting. If you think in Italy, people of even my generation inherited so much art and live in such small spaces that there's very little collecting even amongst peer group. So it's quite a cultural activity rather than one that many people can live by. That another difference is that artists there would not invite you to their studio for many years until they really, really trusted you. So discussions don't go on there. It's because they're frightened you'll pitch their ideas for your next show and get it out before you do. The scientists behave this way too, I must say. New Zealand, that's not the case. That's the site of interesting discussion, either that or the telephone. So now you're seeing these brushstroke paintings, like this one which is called Bumblebee. These two have all been painted in 1971. This one is just blue, orange, green. Now those few classes I had with McCann influenced my direction in a very strange way. McCann, who I have to say, those few classes I had with him despaired of what I was doing. I had a small painting about this size. It was a picture I was trying to make of kidney fern leaves on a clay bank. Now, if you know the kidney fern, it has a sort of an edge around it that is illuminated from behind in the right kind of light. So it's like green plastic almost, and this colour fascinated me. But I was busy painting it out week after week, and McCann gave up on me. One night, he took the 6 to 8 of us who were in his class out onto a balcony on this tower, and made us stand looking north towards the trees in Albert Park. And he said, look at that massed foliage against the pale night sky, and now I want you to imagine drawing directional lines that follow the directions of those clumps and compare them to the edges of a frame or of your canvas. And in that way, you find the real identity of those that foliage. It's not just an amorphous mass. But actually, that wasn't really the lesson he was trying to teach us, I don't believe. It was a matter of the sort of McGree story where when's a pipe not a pipe, when it's a painting of a pipe. Well, this is, McCann was trying to emphasize that picture that you're making is a reality equal to, if not stronger, for the artist, than the reality you're working from. Well, I took it all very seriously. At a certain point, I set off on a series of abstract paintings. It took about a year. My main concern was to learn about colour. As an advertising artist, I'd always worked in black and white. But I also decided to say goodbye to art history and start off with a shape or an element that was the basic element. That was the basic element of the artist, that is the brushstroke. And these brushstrokes, wiggly sort of organic shapes, marched down the canvas following the straight edge of the canvas. I really became obsessed with this whole story. I didn't get rid of it until I finally made a publication about 10 years later, with lots of variations on the theme. However, I had an exhibition. In fact, my first exhibition ever was in Bari in the southeast of Italy. I'd met a painter the year before at Urbino Summer School, and he invited me to show him the gallery he ran. I arrived about a day before the show to help mount it, and to my dismay found that the walls were dark black. I wanted them seen on white. Of course, they glowed like jewels on this dark black with the spotlights on them. But the trouble is they turned into kind of decorative works, which is not what my intention was. I Okay, so as I say, I went on, and at a certain point I decided that the axes, as I was calling them by now, these coordinates, the vertical and the horizontal, should be within the painting. And that left me free to tear the edges of the canvas. And then I got invited to put in a proposal for the Biennale of Rome in 1976. And this is what I was working on. So this is a baby one, about 40 by 40 centimetres. I made 12 of them, photographed them, and sent them in and said that each one be a metre by a metre, and they were gathered into 3 different groups. And so that took a long while to do it, but I had to paste them on something because I didn't know how they would be hung if they were just the torn canvas by itself. Thus you've got them on a cotton weave stretched onto a backdrop there of a stretcher. At that point I decided to come back to the world of art. I remembered T.S. Eliot, who said, "There's no culture that can do without its predecessors." So I started to do other kind of things. Now I'll tell you a bit about my life. I went from Auckland in 1963, accompanying my husband to London. He won a scholarship to study theoretical physics at Imperial College. We travelled on either, I can't remember now whether it was the Fair Sky or the Fair Sea Italian line, and we had 5 weeks going through Suez. And so I began to learn Italian solidly. That's what I did during that time. And then in London, I managed to go to 2 different art schools part-time. One while I was pregnant with Lisa was Sir John Cass, and I met 2 marvellous artists, one of whom was part Italian, and the 3 of us shared a studio in Flood Street for a while in Chelsea. And then the second one was the Byam Shore, which is now, I think, part of Central St Martin's in London, but was initially a very ancient school from the beginning of 1900s. And there it was being run by a man called Maurice de Saumarez, who had written a textbook the previous year called Basic Design, wait a minute, I better get it right. Basic Design, the Dynamics of Visual Form. And in it, he brought the Bauhaus teaching to the UK, really for the first time it entered into the art schools. Well, shortly after I had been there for a term, maybe part-time, my husband got tapped on the shoulder to go to Trieste, where his professor had opened up a physics centre a couple of years prior. We had 1 week's notice, Christmas Eve or something like that, so by New Year we were actually there. And starting over again, I bought a big dictionary, took it with me, and I took along de Saumarez's textbook. And once there, began to work through all the constructivist exercises that were in it. In short, a year or so later, I met a marvellous man called August Chernigoy. He was a professor, and he was fairly elderly, still teaching. He must have been in his 60s at this point. He'd been himself at Weimar at the Bauhaus for a period, taught by Moholy-Nagy and Kandinsky. It's a bit that sort of bridge thing again, where he brought the information down to Ljubljana in the 20s, late 20s, and then to his hometown of Trieste, where he worked as a teacher for many years until he retired at about 70. And then he took on people, usually a group in their 40s who had been at high school under him earlier and were all now artists, and he included me in the group, and I also took engraving lessons with him. But he organised my first solo shows and group shows in Trieste in the late 60s. My first show in New Zealand was in Wellington in 1970 at the Beck Duncan, and now the secret comes out. This is a painting that's never been exhibited. It's about the size of this tabletop. That's painted, I think it's acrylic painted on board. It's called The Four Friends. It demonstrates in a way that I still was under a McCann influence. This time it was on purpose, that is, I was quoting his hills to a certain degree. The electric cord was hanging over the painting one day. It belonged to a lampstand, and the light was turned off. When my Professor Chunagoi just popped in, unannounced, unexpected, and he saw this painting and threw up his hands in horror. He couldn't stand it. He couldn't stand the sentimentality of the people growing out of nature like trees and so on. And then he pointed out to me how the cord, the real cord, resembled the dangling of the hands. And he dared me, joker that he was, to actually add it into the painting. So I did. I exhibited it. And so, the strange thing is that I was really inhibited from showing figurative painting for a long while after that experience. But those paintings that I kept on making in between the abstract ones are now the ones I prefer. You know, those 10 years of abstract painting were kind of like a scientific exercise of a student, something like that. And these ones are richer for me now. I don't have really great photographs, so I'm showing you a detail of painting. That was a series that went on for about 10 years, in which I was able to bring together the concerns of my mentors and teachers, sort of the constructivist background, with elements that were figurative. And so here I have used a fragment of an engraving, which I used a great deal because it's such a beautiful engraving. It was a wood engraving made from a Charles Heatley painting, a watercolour painting. And the wiggly lines of the anonymous engraver are very vital, and I've used them in different portions of this engraving as just one element in many, many paintings. I was at this time also living, I'd become homesick, and so I spent about 4 months a year in New Zealand at that period, and was going back and forth. My husband would take 3 months leave of absence and come for a while and then go back. And these paintings accumulated, and so I needed to find an outlet in Auckland, and I went to visit Rodney Kirk Smith. He was busy packing on the day that I arrived to the appointment, and I was rather cross because he was supposed to be looking at my colour slides. But to help him get them done, I got down on the floor, give him a hand, and I kneed my skirt. I was wearing a skirt, and I put my knee through it, and Rodney, quick as a flash, just sort of said, from riches to rags in 2 seconds flat. He lent me his jacket, which I held in front of me. It was just on closing time. His gallery was just up the road from Smith & Coe and so on, so I dashed down. I did Smith & Coe. Those days John's Talk was across the road. I went on there, got a replacement. And afterwards he took me out to dinner and spent a lot of time looking at my colour slides to make up for it all. So I went off to Italy again, thinking I might be exhibiting with him, but in the meantime a chap called Murray Lazelle rang me in Italy and invited me to come and meet him when I was next in Auckland. He'd heard along the grapevine and wanted to see the paintings, etc. He's a forensic accountant, I believe, works in Auckland at present, and he took a few years out from his career after the wine box business, which pretty well exhausted him for a while. And his second love was painting, and I must say he is the most marvellous curator ever. He put works together, disparate works, because by this time I was also working in relief on sort of long wooden boards that were like boxes, and they were formed on the wall as sort of another kind of composition of their own, and included figurative elements as well. And he was able to put these together with canvases and make sense of it all. These paintings were mostly using that engraving, which was about the gold rush in the Coromandel. The gold had been found by Heafy along with a few other local diggers. Heafy, though, was the surveyor, the official surveyor for the government, and he came with Governor Wynyard when there was going to be a conference to try and work out a way with the local iwi what sort of lease could be negotiated so that the diggers that were arriving from the California gold rush, and there were sailing ships parked in the bay in front of Coromandel, could actually have the right to dig and search. The bay that the conference took place in is now called Waiuna Bay. Some of you might know it from holidays. Then, though, it was called Pata Pata. And Heafy wrote the name on his watercolour, and it was only years later that I did find the name. The engraving I'd found was, in an old newspaper which I'd searched out in the library. In those days you could still actually physically touch the 19th century newspapers. Now, to complete paintings that I needed to do for New Zealand exhibitions, when I travelled back to Italy, I would roll the paintings up and put them across on the diagonal on the largest suitcase that was allowed on those long distance flights back then. We're talking, I guess we're into early 90s by now. And I, of course, was trying to save money. I didn't want to have to send them separately. But one day, once again, I'm now going to introduce my gallery dealer, Nadia Bassanese, who's a wonderful woman in Trieste who ran a private gallery of 3 rooms, and she came by my studio having been accustomed to seeing and exhibiting abstract work, and saw some of these unfinished paintings pinned to the wall with nails. I was working on them, and decided immediately she wanted to show those because she thought her public would be interested in. Some of them were about the land wars. There were different etchings included, and some of these soft barrels of guns and many other images. However, beforehand, I was invited to exhibit some of them, or some similar to them, in Slovenia. This is a detail of one of the paintings that had 4 panels, and it's called Pororua Plaza. This exhibition in Slovenia, which was in the City Gallery, I made 2 paintings or 2 groups of paintings that faced one another. One is about occupation of Pororua, if you like, and the other the occupation of Trieste over the centuries. I was invited by the director, probably because he wanted to exhibit Giorgio Vavasori, one of his Italian painters, and also Oronea Pamici, who had also never exhibited in Yugoslavia, but Giorgio had. And in this way, Giorgio could exhibit without it being yet just one more solo show. Well, we were offered the full gallery, 3 floors of it, and huge. And so, of course, we happily accepted to do this. But, one of the things we decided to do was to visit each other's studios. Up until then, we hardly ever saw each other's work. And so we trusted each other, and then decided we'd allow each other to be contaminated. That is, influences, they called it contaminated, in order to sort of have some sort of connection running between the works without us necessarily identifying it in so many words. But inadvertently, we became caught up in the crumbling of the Iron Curtain. 1990, where we had the invitation. It was going to be for 1991. Berlin Wall had come down in November of '89, and all the information was that 1991 was going to be a bad year, and indeed it was. Trieste was only about 15 minutes drive from the border, and by now there was a road that only meant Trieste to Ljubljana, the capital where the exhibition was to be, was only just over an hour's distance. Finally, the gallery reopened in 1992 after closing for a bit the duration, and they decided, the gallery director there decided, Bassin was his name, that this should be a bit of a celebration. I think we might have been the first foreigners after the gallery reopened. So there was the cultural minister, the foreign minister, a live band, there was the TV news broadcast, was there ahead of time, and they broadcast the whole event as a sort of spectacle for the locals to come to. So it was a huge party that went on half the night. Now the reason for these works being about occupation, I think, was because this damn war was going on. And Trieste was a town that had been occupied after the Italians had been there for centuries by Austrians, followed by the French, followed by the Nazis, and even became part of the Third Reich, and then the New Zealanders for 40 days, and chased out the Yugoslavs, and then the British until 1953, and so even that long after the war there was still a kind of civil war because the city was a very mixed population and divided up ethnically and politically. The reason the Rome government put the International Physics Centre, offered the space there, was because it was such a difficult town and also needed income, and the physicists over the years, more and more physicists came there from overseas. But it was a peacemaking effort, and Nadia took place in this by inviting many people from outside, many artists from outside of our area of Italy. She first exhibited work by Ian Hunter of Ansart fame, who now lives in England, and consequently 3 artists who were selected by CVs and slides collected by Anne Kirker, who was a curator at the National Gallery in Wellington. Anne was visiting me at a time of a Venice Biennale, and we went off together to a vernissage, which is sort of the private viewing. They had 4 days of them, and in those days the authorities were incredibly respectful towards working artists, even those not exhibited in the event. And beautiful invitations would arrive, you and one other, to come to one of the 4 days, and so that's what we did. We took the train and went, and by the time we got back home that day, because we were only an hour and a half by train each way, Anne and Nadia had formed a friendship and decided to do this exhibition for the following year. And Anne, back in New Zealand, got the artists who might be interested, contacted them all, they sent their slides and CVs, etc. And eventually Nadia chose 3, and they were Philippa Blair and Pauline Rhodes and Chris Booth. And some of them stayed on and did work, or returned and did work in other years in Trieste. And Rodney Kirk-Smith made the journey for the opening, and so did Luke Barringer, who opened that series of exhibitions. Luke was to return again. I had approached Giancarlo Politi, who was the editor of Flash Art, to try in Milan, to try and get a review of an exhibition I was having in Milan, and we just got talking, and it was still before we'd done this group exhibition with my 2 colleagues in Trieste up in Ljubljana. And Politi was interested in this because he and his partner Kompova were going to be curating a section of the next Venice Biennale, which was going to be 1993, dedicated to groups of artists or artist curators. So it was really up his street. But as soon as he heard New Zealand did not have a presence at the Biennale, that was canned. No way. We had to be there as in an official capacity. So I'd already lobbied the New Zealand government, pointing out that use could be made of a New Zealand Biennale entry for publicity beyond art itself into the trade area. Certainly it irked me that our country had no way of participating in this top international venue for exhibiting the latest in visual art, because curators from around the world recruited artists for their exhibitions from it, and New Zealanders were certainly missing out. Luke and Jan and I travelled to Trieste one year for an appointment at the Biennale office in a non-Biennale year. We needed to understand the bureaucratic steps required for New Zealand to take part. The invitation, we were told, could only come about if Italy was certain our country would welcome it. This was the crux of the 20-minute meeting. Via the New Zealand ambassador in Rome, and official requests would have to be made that came from our head of government. I'm not sure what happened next, but probably Luke took this back to Wellington. Certainly I eventually handed over all the material and letters and goodness, there was a lot of correspondence, goodness knows why, to the person who created New Zealand, who eventually got the job of getting it organised. And the invitation did eventuate, and there was a sticking point for a moment that New Zealand might be required to promise eventually to build a pavilion, or couldn't they share with Australia? No. The idea was that we would just simply rent a space elsewhere outside the gardens, and at first this was frowned upon, but it's become quite normal now, and that is what, of course, we have been doing. The first artist chosen for this first exhibition, I can't remember what date it was, were Jacqueline Fraser and Peter Ronaldson, and I got myself commissioned as a journalist from New Zealand Art Magazine so that I could attend all the parties. Greg Burke was the curator that year. He had worked at the Wellington City Gallery, and under his curatorial control, the shows there were by established artists with work already constructed earlier. And then, under John Luthart, who opened the gallery in the first place, it was a place of experiment, and the artist was invited on the basis of previous work to ideate a new work for a project or a theme. For example, and somebody mentioned it to me today, the really quite daring exhibition for its time, Mana Tiriti. Now that was 50% Maori, 50% Pākehā, a first. And he got a lot of flack for it. It's hard to imagine now, but that's how it was in 1990. Nadia continued to invite New Zealand artists to her 3 rooms and her gallery in Trieste. She asked Laura Safford, a local art historian and freelance curator, to conceive of a series of exhibitions which paired 2 artists each time. She was interested in what she called transient artists, and by this she meant artists who didn't identify in their art primarily with a place, but also primarily with some other sort of identity marker, with feminism or cultural ethnicity, etc. She was trying to find artists who were outside of those parameters. The overall title for these series of exhibitions, and I don't know, I think there were about 6 of them, was Lontananse, which means distances. So I was given the first pop at this, and you can see both my works in the exhibition, but the one in the room immediately in front of you is called Next Nearest Neighbours. Now, I decided the distances were going to be about the infinitesimal distances between particles in the nucleus. And also I used the opportunity to tease my husband and his colleagues who have the temerity to take words like colour and flavour to describe the characteristics of their particles. And they would call their structures of particles and whatever dimensions they were thinking of, like 10-dimensional space, neighbours, next nearest neighbours, second nearest neighbours. So here we have next nearest neighbours. The New Zealand artist I invited to share this exhibition was Julian Dashper, whose work I had seen in Ed McLeady's gallery in Wellington, and they were colour slides in a sleeve of, I don't know how many, maybe 15 colour slides hanging on the wall, slightly out from the wall on 2 big hooks, so that the light came up the white wall and shone through a bit so that you could read each colour slide, which were all identical anyway. But this was, when I talked to him by phone, he said this was about travelling overseas with your art without having to do the whole thing of packaging and couriering and spending money, and we went into environmentalism then, so it wasn't about the stupidity of carrying works long distances. And this was about distance, so he got invited and accepted and came and did completely different works, but it's okay for that exhibition. Now our exhibition together was due to stay open for a month, but halfway through, the person who was having the next exhibition wanted to bring it forward, and we didn't really have much choice. This person was Leo Castelli, the famous dealer from New York, whom Nadia had sought out in New York some year or so before. The reason being, Leo Castelli was born in Trieste in 1907 and eventually left, went to Paris, eventually got to New York, and you probably all know the story. There's galleries and so on. But he had never received acknowledgement back home. And a few times when he tried to go back to Trieste, he got snubbed, including by the local modern museum. He so appreciated the work, or the regard that Nadia had for him, that he rewarded her with exhibition after exhibition of his galleries, artists. But this particular exhibition was only the second one. The first one had been posters. The second one was a photographic exhibition telling the history of his galleries. So you saw the artists and their artworks in black and white photographs all around the wall. Well, we closed our exhibition. He put up his. It lasted for a month or so. And as a reward, he took us out to dinner. Well, he said he was going to, but we decided to do it alla romana, so we each one paid for ourselves. This was a bit disappointing for a cousin of his who'd always been helped long distance by Leo, and he was an elderly man who came with us to this dinner. He was quite a big gossip, actually. He was a good source of information for the town. But he hissed as I went up to pay for myself and a friend, "You can't let this rich man not pay for you when he offers," you know, because it meant he had to pay for himself too, which was a new experience. This sort of a coda to this story, because there were some new graphics by Jasper Johns that Nadia was about to, who did exhibit in her gallery in Trieste, in parallel with them having a first showing in the Venice Biennale. And then she had promised to lend them to a gallery up in Ljubljana the following year. Now, I read all the English language papers, especially the New York Herald Tribune that was available, International Herald Tribune that was available in Italy. But I'd also travelled from last time from New Zealand via the States, and on the trip from Los Angeles I was going to Washington, I sat next to a man who, once I told him my destination, turned out to be a Pentagon fellow, and he said, "Things are brewing up, we know what's going to happen. Get your husband and clear out of there." But of course we didn't. But the war then, of course, did break out. And I told this to Nadia, and she cancelled the show up in Ljubljana. I don't think Jasper Johns ever got shown there. But whether it's interesting, I think it probably is, but her gallery was financed by secondary market sales. She was sort of in the know with a lot of gallery dealers, also in Vienna, and say somebody would in Vienna might ring one of the dealers and say, "Well, look, I'm looking for a Miro for one of my collectors. Can you find one amongst your Italian colleagues?" And so she would get her commission, and in this way keep the gallery going, because new art really wasn't being collected in our small city. We moved to Topolo, a little village up on the Slovene border, about 5 minutes walk from it, in the foothills of the Julian Alps. Now the curator, Moreno Miorelli, was a poet who was teaching in the northeast and got to know these valleys and hills. And he financed an event that started this year that I first exhibited there in 1994 by raising public funds. He eventually started off very small. He was able to put up the artists for a week-long residency. It'd be maybe 10 artists altogether, and the work stayed up for a month. The way in which it worked was each artist then invited another artist for the following year. And in this way, because the event has continued for over 20 years now, each year there's been one or more New Zealanders there. including Lauren Lysart and William, I don't know how to say his name, William Sue. It's really quite an extraordinary place. 1994, it was celebrating 1,000 years of existence. Moreno hoped that life would improve in these hills, where the young people left after primary school and went off down into the cities, Italian cities, for work, and only came back as pensioners. And in fact, it's been successful to the point that UNESCO in recognition has paid to renovate many of the houses. The idea was that each artist should visit, if possible, ahead of time. Well, of course, the other New Zealanders couldn't, but they could communicate by emails with Moreno. But I made visits all through one winter, about once a month, to get to know the history of the place. And in my piece, I'm working with a postcard of Austrians manning a cannon in the mountains in the First World War, just nearby, and contrasted to one of Maori doing a performance of the haka. And the images are repeated and backed by an aluminium ribbon of 5 metres long. I needed to be able to roll it up for carrying on the train, for to reach the hill town from Trieste required a journey of a couple of hours with changes. Once there, I had to negotiate with an old man, Giuseppe, who lived in the house next door to the crumbling building I'd selected for my site. Initially, he was hostile. He was against the invasion of artists from who knows where, and in fact, the village itself was divided into the lower part, right-wing and Italian-speaking, whereas above, the inhabitants generally spoke Slovene and voted communist. They were of Slovene culture, but had been divided by the border, even under the Venetian Republic. So they were divided from Austria in those days, and on the other side, there were their Slovene cousins in a village not very far away. Giuseppe became friends, and during a severe storm that year, in July, he climbed up on a ladder and banged in a few more pegs so that my work would stay solidly into the clay that cemented the ancient stone wall. Giro Giro Tondo. This exhibition was also organised by Morelli down in the park of an old villa in the valley. It's called San Giovanni di Natasone. Have I written that? I think I have, yes. We were all rather shocked from what was going on in Sarajevo at the time. And so my piece is about ring-a-ring-a-rosies. So the figures are cut out of fencing and fall as if they're being bombed, like the people in Sarajevo. Moreno had a lot to do with this. I think he talked to all of us artists who also presented anti-war pieces, saying that to meet the needs of a public so harried they can't think about art, you can't make work for white walled galleries as if you're giving a great gift to civilization. People weren't wanting a distraction, that they wanted to have issues, if not actually discussed, at least acknowledged in the public places they entered, he said. Today, the artist hero is gone and is replaced with everyone as artist. Well, I'm not sure that I am of that opinion. However, this is his feeling that this was the lesson of the great German artist Joseph Beuys, whom he talked about a great deal. My response, however, was to return to painting. This is evening in the camp. We're now back in New Zealand, the Kaipara harbour, and the settlement at Albert Land, or just across the water from Albert Land, where the British settlers first tried to set up with their tents. As the local Maori welcomed them, they were at the Auckland area, engaged in conflict with those from further north, and hoped that the British presence would protect them. The sketch here, once again, instead of being my own completely. It is borrowed from a chap called E.S. Brooks, who was one of these first settlers who did a great many sketches, and all his works can now be found in the Wellsford Museum. I became quite fixated on houses and hut shapes, and this work is called A House and the View. Sort of settling in, I suppose you could say, a series of 1950s dwellings. House's elemental form, sitting on a shelf in front of a painted backdrop of ever-changing landscape, fire, rain, corrugated iron. And the curator was a volunteer at the Village Arts in Kohukohu in Hokianga. He's worked for many years as an artist himself, and gives a great deal of time, or has done, I think he's retired now, for free to assist the mounting of shows and looking after them during the days. I sent him, of course, a very detailed plan with measurements of spaces between works and how high up from the ground they should appear. And to finish off, this is the last one. Really, to finish off, to say that artists can't do it without the other artists and the curators. So thank you very much for listening, and I'm happy to take any questions.
Does anyone would like to ask a question to Barbara?
Actually, Barbara, what happened to Nadia Bassanese and her gallery?
I was last back at it in 2007, and she was having a huge party for all the artists, and I was lucky to be there, just arrived at the right time, to say she was closing.
Oh.
She's, she must be in her 80s now. We still exchange Christmas emails, and she shifted into a building just across from the Verdi Theatre, so they can go to all the inner city events in their old age. So all good, yeah. Grandchildren, yeah.
Yes, my question was, what technical question? What do you prefer medium to work on your paintings? I mean,
I started out in oil painting, but I became allergic to whether it was the resins or the tips or the oil paints themselves, and I had to give them up. And so that's back in the 60s, and found bulk oil paints, got them sent from England as acrylic paints, and so gradually got to know them, and of course Liquitex makes wonderful paints, so I've used those ever since, and I feel very at ease with them. That's my preferred medium. Yes.
and do you still paint?
Yes, I've not been doing any new work for exhibiting, but I'm doing small new works at home. I'm exhibiting earlier work when invited, but mostly writing. And in fact, this material is out of a sort of an art, what I call art bio, I've been gradually putting together over the years. Lots of stories. Yes, it's really our art, social history. So some of us have to write it. Mind you, I've been very careful to have no gripes whatsoever in this talk tonight. I can't promise the same in a book.
I'm going to ask you, who can you recall that Ron had exhibiting around the time that you had him exhibiting your work? Because I bought my first art.
No, I didn't exhibit with him in the end.
You
No, because I went off and exhibited with Murray Lizelle.
Okay.
Nobody thought of that.
Oh, really?
But I actually bought Colin McCann from him years before.
I bought my first Pat Hanley from him. That's what you call name dropping.
Anybody else got any questions? Barbara, you can all mix and mingle afterwards anyway. You can talk to yourself. Barbara, I'd just like to say thank you
very much.
so much.